Hello, my name is Tim Richards, and I'll be giving a presentation about diversity awareness and race diversity in Ferguson, Missouri. Uh, the recent controversy surrounding the shooting death of Michael Brown and the subsequent battle between police and protesters has thrust the community of Ferguson and the issue of racial diversity into the national spotlight. Although the resolution of the Brown case is still outstanding, it has become obvious that there's a racial diversity disconnect between this community and the local police force. Looking at the situation and the rapid escalation of tensions, it is obvious the issue of race is a sensitive subject in this community. In this presentation, I will examine the history of diversity in Ferguson and will assess current racial diversity within the community. The goal of this presentation is to educate the people of Ferguson and to encourage more inclusive choices in local governance of the community. Despite a history of racial discrimination, the only way to end discrimination is to educate people of the history and develop inclusive paths forward for the future. Oppression not only starts with people, it also ends with people. So looking at race diversity within Ferguson in 2010, based on U.S. Census information. The community of Ferguson, located in St. Louis County, is about 30% white and 70% black. This is in contrast to the overall county, where the demographic is flipped, with about 70% of the population being white and 25% being black. Although not in line with the statistical makeup of similar cities in the United States, there's nothing wrong with having a predominantly black community, or any other grouping of people. Now, to make the numbers a little cleaner, I've eliminated the classifications that are neither white or black. It has been widely reported that the Ferguson Police Department has 53 officers, 50 are white, 3 are black. Compared to the community demographic, there appears to be a lack of diversity within the force. Ferguson has a population comprised of 67% blacks, but a police force that's 94% white. To give some perspective, let's ask, how do the racial demographics between Ferguson and the county compare to the national average? And more importantly, how does the police demographics of Ferguson stand up against national averages of similar populations served? Again, looking at the census data from 2007 and 2010, in cities with populations of 10 to 25,000 people, the national average of white police is about 75% for the whites, and blacks make up about 12% on a national platform. This very closely lines up with the overall demographic of the national population. Nationally, police demographics are just about as diverse as the population itself. When looking at Ferguson's demographics compared to that of its police force, and then comparing it against similar sized cities and national averages, it appears there is a lack of diversity on the police force. It just doesn't appear. There is, let's just call it what it is. There is a lack of diversity on the Ferguson police force. Now, we could play devil's advocate and say, hey, perhaps this is simply an issue of skewed numbers because of a small city sample size compared up to national numbers. For example, if a city was only 100 people and there was one white cop and 0 black ones, it would not be fair to report that there is a racial diversity issue in that city just based off that statistic. So is it possible this is not an issue of race? Well, let's discuss the history of the region. The greater St. Louis metropolitan area has changed dramatically over the last 100 years. Slavery ended in the 1800s, but segregation did not lawfully end until the 1950s. Numerous attempts were made by local public and private authorities to oppress blacks through the first half of the 1900s. In 1916, a zoning ordinance was passed that oppressed blacks. This was overturned in court. However, this led to the 1923 and 1940 Realtors Agreements. These agreements, some formal, some formal and public, some informal and private, pressured realtors into not selling homes to black folks in any area not constrained by the original zoning ordinance that was overthrown in court. There were some minor changes and consolidations over the years, but the area restricted to black people was near the urban center, and I'm going to show it to you here in the next few slides. By the 1940s, over 380 covenants existed in the region, specifically blocking, quote, Negroes from owning property. The New Deal era Homeowners Loan Corporation drew risk maps for the city for lenders to use in assessing risk on new mortgages. The drawing of these maps was most influenced by race. With the exception of redlining maps, risk maps, Ferguson was not specifically part of any restricted property in the region. However, racial discrimination was rampant in the region, and Ferguson's southern border was located at the northern end of the boundaries set in the 1941 Realtors Agreement. Let's have a look at these maps. Colin Gordon of the University of Iowa created some very cool maps to show the areas of white or black population increase or decrease in St. Louis County over the last 70 years. As you'll see, beginning in the 1940s, there's a black influx into the urban center. No other place for blacks to go because they're restricted there. In the 1950s, there's continued black increase with significant white decrease in that area. By 1960s, the population center abandons urban downtown St. Louis. As blacks move out, the whites expand further outward. 1970s, this continues. Ferguson has a massive influx of black population. In the 1980s, the demographics are 85% white, 14% black. 30 years later, they've just about flipped, 29% white and 67% black. So here are those maps, and this is from the 1940s. And you can see here with the white dots that indicates an increase of white population. The black areas indicate an increase of black population. The red is where whites are leaving. The orange is where blacks are leaving. And you can see here I've drawn the boundary from the 1941's Realtor Agreement. And you can see here in this population map that the blacks really were oppressed. They were confined to this specific area. And if you notice on the top part of this area, I've outlined the boundaries of where Ferguson is. And it sits right there on that boundary. In the 1950s, it's a continuation of the 40s. As blacks move in, whites move out. You'll also notice that there's a move out of the core, out of central downtown St. Louis. This isn't necessarily attributed to race. This is just a sign of the times as people abandoned urban settings and sought to live in the suburbs with white picket fences and, live the American dream. So that's what that shift indicates there. But as you can see, there's more blacks moving into the area, and whites are continuing to expand into the region. In the 1960s, again, it's just a continuation of the 50s. Because it's no longer restricted by federal law, with official discrimination outlawed and urban decay in full effect throughout the United States, the lawns drawn by the 41 Realtors Agreement aren't so applicable. However, it is very interesting to see how these lines established areas of race saturation. Blacks were forced to live within the very tight boundaries and had no other choice but to establish themselves in these areas. Here we are in the 1970s. Again, it's a continuation of the 60s. Blacks move in, whites move out. As segregation and racist views begin to exit the mainstream culture of America, the black population of the region really sprawls out from the urban defined areas. As the blacks move into more desirable neighborhoods, whites vacate. This is when black people start moving into Ferguson. By 1980, the Ferguson population is 85% white, 14% black, like we talked about. The area of Ferguson at this point in time in the 1980s is highly desirable for all people, and there's a general population increase in Ferguson. In the 1990s, there's an exodus of white people from Ferguson, along with an influx of black people into the city. In the region, whites are beginning to move well west of the city, while blacks continue sprawling from the urban center. By 2010, as we know, the demographic in Ferguson was basically flipped, 30% white, 70% black. However, the police force and local governance did not change to the changing demographics. So we've discussed the issue in the diversity lens of geography. Now let's briefly discuss diversity through a biological lens. You know, some of you may be asking yourself, well, hey, is there a biological difference between blacks and whites? And the answer is no. The common belief that race is biologically significant has been scientifically proven to be invalid. This is common knowledge amongst all scientists of the world, basically, that there's no biologically significant factor that goes into race. Is there a genetic difference between races? The answer to that is no. There's more genetic differences within races than between them. I mean, everybody is different genetically. However, when you look at a macro view of the human genome, that's what we're talking about here. Blacks or any other race are not inferior based on anything that has to do with them biologically. That's what the point is here. Some of you might be saying, oh, come on, there's differences in our DNA. You know, there must be differences. And like I said, indeed there are. However, there's about 6% difference in DNA variation between races, white, black, Asian, Spanish, what have you. 6% difference. The other variations, 94% of what we see in the human genome, are within the same race. And something that scientists agree on is the origin of humans. There's some disagreement about the specific timing, but in general, everybody agrees that all humans originated in Africa some 60 to 100,000 years ago. Look, we're all biologically the same. We just look different. So let's look at things through a sociology lens. I mean, we know the geographic history of racism against blacks in Ferguson is the seed of ongoing racial oppression. We know that race demographics in the police force are skewed. We know that there's a demonstrated racism on the police force. There is demonstrated lack of community involvement. Oppression prevails and gets worse over time, and we're living it right now. Now, I make a couple assertions here, like there's a demonstrated racism on the police force, a demonstrated lack of community involvement. You know, the demonstrated lack of community involvement and the demonstrated racism we're going to talk about here in a pretty graphic example. So let's look at a case study here of a man named Henry Brown. He was arrested in September of 2009. Turns out he was arrested for nothing. He was 100% innocent. He committed no crime. It just turned out by the stroke of luck he was traveling through town. He was black, and he had the same name, the exact same name as another fugitive. Turns out it was totally not him. This guy was totally exonerated. Well, after being beaten by Ferguson police when he was taken back to the station, he was subsequently charged with property damage after his blood got on the uniforms of the police who beat him. You know, this is one of those come on man type situations. Like, why is this behavior tolerated by a democratic community? Prior to 2003, what I have here is from the Missouri Attorney General, and these are the stop rates by the police department based on the ethnicity of the people that they stopped. And prior to 2003, the police stop rates in Ferguson held steady with the demographics. Beginning in 2003, though, police stop rates of black people became disproportionate. Less whites and more blacks were stopped by the police. There was a loss of control of the community having over the police department. Everything got skewed. Over here in 2003, you can see that it's very disproportionate, with by far the majority of all stops being people who were black. Here's a statement from Ferguson Mayor James Knowles shortly after the Michael Brown shooting, when he was asked about what is going on the police force. Why isn't the police force comprised of something similar to the community that they serve? And he said, "We hire everyone that we can get. There's also the problem that a lot of young African American people don't want to go into law enforcement. They already have this disconnect with law enforcement. So if we find people who want to go into law enforcement who are African American, we're all over it because we want them to help us bridge the gap." Should the attitude be to specifically hire blacks, or should it be having a police force with a stake in the community? That is, to have public servants serve the community. And if the local governance understands there's a disconnect of the large part of the community from the police force, as the mayor obviously knows, what is the police force doing to fix the situation? What's the mayor's office doing? Does the police fund outreach, education, or diversity programs, or are large parts of their operational budget being allocated for new military-style equipment? The same equipment used to suppress demonstrations and protests following the shooting of Michael Brown. Would the community be better served if the maintenance budget for that equipment was instead spent on special training programs to solicit members of the community to join the police force? A racial diversity issue plus a lack of critical thinking by the people who are in charge, like the mayor, equals continued racial issues. It's time for the community to drive change. The American Anthropological Association has the scientific view on the definition of race, and this is fascinating. Today, scholars in many fields argue that race, as it is understood in the United States of America, was a social mechanism invented during the 18th century to refer to those populations brought together in colonial America. The English and other European settlers that conquered Indian people and those people of Africa brought in to provide slave labor. So, we know the geographic history. We know the specific race issue in Ferguson. There's an issue with the police. And the police have power and racism and power and lack of diversity only perpetuate the cycle repeating itself. We know that there's a disconnect between the community and its governance. It's not like the population shifted 2 years ago, and this is something that's been brewing for decades. Why isn't the community getting more involved? We know that there's a disconnect. What can we do to empower the oppressed and eliminate a crippling disconnect between the community and the population? So we can take a sociological approach to a diversity solution. And there's a couple of different theories. There's this functional approach where it says that all members of the community must assimilate. Living in the community is just that. You're part of this city. You go to the ball games. You walk down the sidewalks. You say hello to your neighbors. You know what's happening and where it's happening, and you're part of the city. You have to assimilate. But it's just not socially. It's also economically and culturally. Some of these functional theories talk about the assimilation process being about all of those. There's also a symbolic interaction approach, where it talks about interactions between people. So people of race and their social interactions. Does a particular race not socialize and get out in town to even be able to assimilate or to enjoy some of whatever the rest of the community is doing? And the symbolic interaction also talks about interactions between races. A white guy and a black guy approach each other on the street, and if the white guy feels uncomfortable at any level, what can you do to eliminate that discomfort? Why isn't it just another guy that you're walking by on the street? Instead of taking a technical or theoretical approach, let's just talk about some common sense here. The sociology lens provided a good path to critically think about some short-term and long-term diversity goals. And here's a great one right here. Have the police take immediate stock in their own diversity. This is common sense. And the community needs to take charge of their community, of their governance, through the democratic process. The democratic process sees no race, especially on a local level, where big money doesn't necessarily have as large effect as it does on our representatives on the state or federal level. We can challenge the community, challenge ourselves to continually participate and to always maintain control over our elected officials. We can challenge to do what is right, not just for us specifically, but to all humans. Remember, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Let's end racism and become involved. Diversity is not necessarily about black and white. Diversity is about assimilating all people into the community. If this cannot be done, it is up to the people to effect reforms. Increase diversity awareness within the community. Motivate the local society to make a change. Teach the local government leadership the importance of the history and racial diversity within their departments. And get out there and vote. We got control, folks. Use the democratic process and vote. And if what you have going on is not working right now, you have the power to fix it. Go out there and vote.